If you don't give us the bonus, we will all quit. I run a cafe and hired 3 temp workers to keep the place staffed. One of them, Chris Wilson, is a polite and competent young man who's good with customers. But soon after, they all started slacking off and giving me, their boss, an attitude. When I asked what their problem was, Chris and the others flashed their resignation letters at me and made selfish demands. "Got it. Your contracts all end today." I replied, fed up with their defiance, and I accepted their resignations on the spot. I then reported their behavior to their temp agency. However, Chris, refusing to let it go, filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against me. My name is Steve Smith, and I'm 43 years old. A few years ago, I quit my corporate job to fulfill my dream of running a small cafe. When I left, my boss and co-workers all told me I was making a mistake and would fail. But the desire to do something I love outweighed my fear of staying stuck as a corporate drone. With the guidance of a business-savvy friend, I learned about sanitation, the mindset of a cafe owner, and security measures before opening my small cafe. Little by little, I'm gaining more customers, and every day I'm hopeful for even more success. When I first opened the cafe, I managed it alone. But as the number of customers grew, I found myself overwhelmed with work. Especially during summer vacation and holidays, tourists would flood in, and it became chaotic. To get more help, I signed a labor dispatch contract with the staffing agency, Moyato Recruit. Now, whenever I need extra hands, they send workers. Soon, 3 temp workers from Moyato Recruit arrived. They were all 23 years old and friends. One of the young men greeted me with a bright smile. "Nice to meet you. I'm Chris Wilson, sent by Moyato Recruit." Chris proudly mentioned that he had worked in customer service during college. When I was on the floor, products sold out immediately, and we gained loyal customers. The manager praised me highly. "A temp worker with customer service experience is more than welcome. Looking forward to working with you," I said, handing them aprons as uniforms and explaining the cafe's rules. They were quick learners, and despite it being their first day, they smoothly served the customers. Chris, in particular, became popular with the female customers, even posing for pictures with them. Watching this, I couldn't help but mutter to myself, "Wow, we've got a newcomer who's exceeding expectations." But a week later, Chris and the others started acting out. Even when I scolded them for goofing off during cleaning, they would slack off again as soon as I looked away. While they still handled customers, they began to look bored and sometimes treated uninterested customers rudely. Today, Chris showed up an hour late, so I gave him a stern warning. "You were late yesterday too. You're getting sloppy lately, aren't you?" "Well, working late is exhausting. Can't you give us more break time?" Instead of apologizing, he blamed the break time. The other 2 also started napping when the cafe was empty. And at this rate, we'd earn a reputation as the cafe with the worst customer service. So, after closing, I gathered the 3 for a talk. But Chris and the others glared at me with dissatisfaction. "What is it? I just want to get home and play video games. You guys have been slacking off too much lately. You're late, you're not cleaning, and on top of that, you're choosing which customers to serve well. Well, when a pretty woman comes in, you get more excited, right? LOL, right?" Chris nudged the other 2, and they nodded in agreement. "Don't be picky about the customers. If you have any complaints, I'm here to listen, but you need to take your job more seriously." I said this to them, exasperated, and Chris raised his hand. "Then how about more break time and a raise? Don't we get any paid leave?" At my cafe, we pay $11 per hour for an 8-hour shift with a 1-hour break. Paid leave is granted after 6 months of continuous employment and at least 80% attendance, earning you 10 days off. You guys haven't even been here a month yet. If you want paid leave, you need to work seriously, I gently reminded him, and Chris clicked his tongue and sighed. "TCH man, you're so stingy." "Hey, Watch your tone when talking to your boss. Annoyed by his attitude, I warned him more firmly. But instead of feeling sorry, Chris and the others just laughed at my reaction. I felt my face grow hot, as if they were mocking me. Are you harassing temp workers? We belong to the staffing agency, so we can report you anytime. At first, I thought these guys were capable and friendly. But in reality, they disrespected me and had no intention of working properly, the worst kind of temps. Lately, the sloppiness in their customer service has become noticeable, and I receive complaints from customers about dirty tables. Even so, Chris and the others pretended not to care and played games where I couldn't see them. At this rate, the cafe's reputation would suffer and customers would start staying away. I realized I had made a huge mistake in hiring Chris and his friends, wishing I had never brought them on board. Seeing me down, Chris smirked and said arrogantly, "If you give us bonuses, we'll work seriously." I grew increasingly frustrated with these guys who barely worked but only wanted money. Then, Chris and the others took out some memo paper and a pen and started writing something. Curious, I watched as they finished and tossed the paper at me. It was messily scrawled with the words "resignation letter." "If you don't give us bonuses, we'll all quit." For a moment, I hesitated, but then I said clearly, "Fine, your contracts all end today." "What?" Chris, half smiling, looked at the other two. "Are you serious?" "I'm dead serious. I'll wire your pay for this month, so don't bother coming in tomorrow." I meant it. I didn't need people who were just going to ruin my cafe. "You'll be in trouble without us. Think you can run this place by yourself?" "At least without you guys, I'll have less stress. If I need more help, I'll just hire part-timers." Seeing that they were no longer needed, the other two besides Chris started looking worried. "If you still want to work here, apologize for your attitude and promise to work seriously." I left the door open for them to redeem themselves, waiting to see how they'd respond. Chris and the others exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Growing impatient with their hesitation, I snapped, "If you can't even apologize, what good are you? You're supposed to be professionals, even if you're temp workers." Chris glared at me, clearly offended by my reprimand. "I don't want to work at some lame cafe like this. I can't even brag about it to my parents or friends." "Then quit. With that kind of attitude, you'll have a hard time finding your next job." His face turned bright red as he angrily stomped out of the cafe. "Let's get out of here. Staying at this place is a waste of time." "Hey, wait. I need those aprons back." I called after them, demanding they return the aprons I had lent them. The three of them, clearly annoyed, took off the aprons and tossed them onto the floor. "Hope this place goes under soon." Chris spat those words as he walked out. Left alone, I picked up the aprons from the floor and carefully folded them. What a shame. I thought I'd hired capable temps, but that didn't turn out well. I smirked as I looked at their resignation letters. But lucky for me, they quit on their own. It's going to be tough starting tomorrow, but I'll just hire new temps or part-timers and keep going. After finishing the remaining closing tasks, I headed home as well. The next day, I was nervous about suddenly losing 3 workers, but I managed to run the cafe. The cafe's space was only the size of a classroom, and everything on the menu was quick to prepare, so I didn't keep any customers waiting. In fact, with less stress from having to keep Chris and the others in line, I found the work busier but more fulfilling. "Thank you, please come again." After surviving the rush of lunchtime and things had calmed down, the cafe's phone rang. "Hello, this is Steve." The call was from the person in charge at Moyato Recruit, the staffing agency. Since we don't communicate often, I started to worry about what this could be about. "Thank you for your continued support. How can I help you?" The manager's tone was polite, but carried an air of authority as he said, "I need to confirm some details about an alleged wrongful termination." "Wait, wrongful termination?" Confused by his words, I tried to stay calm and listen. It seemed that after leaving the cafe, Chris and the others went to Moyato Recruit to file a complaint. The manager had heard that they were wrongfully terminated and hadn't been paid, which made him suspicious of me. If the claim of wrongful termination were true, it would be seen as a violation of labor laws, and I'd be subject to corrective action. Feeling completely baffled by the false accusations, I quickly denied them. Please wait. Everything those temp workers said is a lie. I have proof, and I'll send it to you right away. I took a photo of the resignation letters Chris and the others had written yesterday and attached it to an email to the agency. Have you had a chance to check it? The handwriting is messy, but those resignation letters were written by them voluntarily. However, the manager seemed to suspect that I had forced them to write the resignation letters. He even pressured me, saying, "If you're fabricating evidence, your situation will only get worse. It's better to admit it now, and your punishment will be lighter." Though it was frustrating that he didn't believe me, if I let this slide, my cafe would go under. After thinking it over, I decided to send him more proof of my innocence. I've just sent you a copy of my business records and the daily sales logs. I've also kept notes on Chris and the others since their first day. The logs detailed who took days off, who was late, and by how many hours. I made sure to record more than just the time cards, including notes on their daily behavior. As you can see, the temp workers were repeatedly late and defiant towards me. Especially Chris, who was more rude and slacked off more than the other two. And as for this month's pay, it has already been deposited into their accounts. Seeing the payment records, the manager seemed to reconsider. Sensing the shift, I decided to take a firmer stance. Yesterday, after I reprimanded them for their behavior, Chris and the others said they would quit and handed me their resignation letters, which I accepted. Does that look like wrongful termination to you? Caught off guard, he quickly said, "I'll check with Chris and the others right away." Before ending the call, although I was initially shaken when accused of wrongful termination, I'm glad I kept those records. However, the fact that they lied to get me in trouble really ticks me off. I'd love to confront them right now, but doing so might only give them more reasons to cause trouble. I decided to wait for further contact from the agency and think about how to handle it, then return to work. A few hours later, the cafe's door burst open, and Chris and the others barged in noisily. "Steve, get out here." The customers, frightened by their sudden entrance, huddled in the corners of the cafe. Annoyed by their intrusion, I quickly stepped in. "You're disturbing the other customers. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You ratted us out to the agency. Thanks to you, we got in trouble." It seemed the manager at Moyato Recruit had confirmed the facts with Chris and the others, and then gave them a stern warning. I told the truth. Don't lie and make someone else out to be the bad guy. Chris glared at me, fuming, but I wasn't the least bit scared. Your glare doesn't intimidate me. I used to be a corporate guy, so I've had much scarier bosses than you. Still, Chris gritted his teeth, staring me down. If the agency warned you, then take it to heart. If you keep making this a bigger issue, they'll terminate your contract. Getting cut from a temp job is basically the same as being fired. When I warned them, the two guys behind Chris turned pale and looked at me with worry. Seeing their expressions, I gently spoke to them. "If you apologize properly, we can settle this." Immediately, the two pushed past Chris and apologized. They kept apologizing repeatedly, saying, "We're sorry, and we won't cause any more trouble." Over and over. Chris looked shocked and flustered by their behavior. "Hey, you guys, are you betraying me?" But the two replied, "We don't want to lose our jobs," and asked me for reconciliation. "If you've learned your lesson, then we can make up. I'll inform the agency, but don't slack off on the job again." After my final warning, they answered with a cheerful yes, and left the cafe. "Don't leave me behind." Chris tried to chase after them, but stopped because our conversation wasn't finished. I'm glad those two were reasonable. So, what about you, Chris? Abandoned by both the agency and his friends, Chris grimaced. If you apologize to me sincerely, just like they did, we can reconcile. I extended my right hand for a handshake, offering peace. But Chris slapped my hand away and said in a harsh tone, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just joking. And you're the one who wrongfully fired me. Hey, if you keep that up, I'll take this to the next level. I glared back, not backing down, and Chris sneered at me. Yikes, you'll regret going against me. With that parting shot, he stormed out of the cafe. As the shop grew quiet again, I apologized to the customers for the commotion. Though I wondered what Chris, now betrayed by his two friends, would do next. I was relieved the trouble in the cafe had been resolved. The next day, before opening, I stepped outside to water the parted flowers in front of the cafe. Oh, they don't look as healthy as usual. The flowers seemed a bit droopy, lacking their usual vibrancy. I found it strange since I watered them daily and made sure they got plenty of sunlight. Thinking they might need more nutrients, I went to the storage room, grabbed some fertilizer, and added it to the soil. I hope they perk up again. Customers have complimented how pretty they are. Just then, I heard the phone ringing in the cafe and went to answer it. Hello, this is Steve. Hey, has the cafe closed down yet? As soon as I heard the nasty tone, I knew it was Chris. What do you want? I'm busy with opening tasks. If this is nonsense, I'm hanging up. Annoyed that he called so early in the morning, I responded curtly. Humph, you think you can just make coffee in peace? I'm heading to the labor board to file a harassment complaint against you. The labor board? You mean the labor standards office? It turns out he planned to report me to the labor board since the agency didn't believe him. When I expressed my surprise, Chris, sensing an opportunity, began to gloat. If I say I was harassed, your cafe's reputation will definitely take a hit. And with a small shop like yours, it'll go under in no time. Realizing he intended to ruin my beloved cafe, I felt a surge of caution. But I knew I couldn't back down now, so I steeled myself. What's your goal? Why go to such lengths? If you don't want me to report you to the labor board, pay me $100,000 in damages for firing me. Let's just settle this and move on. What? There's no way I'm paying that kind of outrageous money. The amount was so absurd that I couldn't even get angry. I was just dumbfounded. It seemed Chris had refused to settle because he was after compensation for what he claimed was wrongful termination. But regardless, I had no intention of giving a single penny to someone pretending to be the victim. Furious, I spoke to Chris in a cold, firm tone. I'm tired of repeating myself, so let me make this clear. I'm not giving you anything. If you want to sue, go ahead. Chris, perhaps startled by my raised voice, responded with a shaky voice. Yikes, I'm serious. As soon as this call ends, I'm filing a lawsuit. If it turns out I'm innocent, you're the one who's going to be in trouble. Temp workers don't make much, and I won't care if you end up struggling to make ends meet. When I checked his resume, it showed that since graduating from college, he had been living as a temp worker. While temp work offers flexibility, it pays less than a full-time job, making it harder to save money. If he lost the lawsuit, his financial situation would only worsen. That's why I'm demanding compensation. If you don't want your cafe to go under, pay up. Not a chance, I've got work to do. So I'm hanging up now. Oh, and by the way, I recorded this conversation. Excuse me. With that, I hung up the phone without waiting for a response. Chris called back immediately, but I ignored all his attempts. A while ago, a fellow cafe owner advised me to record calls as a precaution against complaints, to ensure I wouldn't end up in a disadvantageous situation. Thanks to that advice, I had the entire conversation recorded. Knowing he was recorded, Chris was probably panicking by now. With evidence on my side, I had no reason to worry about what might happen next. However, Strange things started happening around me after that day. The flowers I had been taking care of suddenly wilted without showing any signs of recovery. Shocked by the sudden withering, I stood there in a daze, wondering why they had died. But the flowers weren't the only thing affected. The ratings for my cafe on review sites plummeted overnight. Comments like, "Terrible cafe," and "The manager's attitude is the worst," filled the pages, leaving me deeply shocked. I couldn't believe that someone who had visited my cafe would think such things. The impact of the negative reviews was significant, and I noticed that customer traffic had started to slow down. In the empty cafe, I muttered to myself, "This is bad. At this rate, I'll be out of business." But the strange occurrences weren't over yet. One morning, I discovered graffiti on the cafe's wall. It looked like it had been sprayed on, and it wasn't going to wash off easily. The once pristine white wall was badly defaced, and I finally lost my temper. Who did this to my store? I was about to start cleaning in anger when I suddenly stopped. Maybe the security cameras caught the culprit in the act. The idea of installing security cameras was actually suggested by a friend. I decided to close the cafe for the day and review the footage. Struggling with the unfamiliar controls, I finally managed to play the video. When I saw the person on the screen, a mix of shock and fury surged through me. "I'm completely furious. I'll never forgive you." Just as I shouted at the person on the screen, I heard a voice in the distance. A few hours later, as I was taking pictures of the graffiti-covered wall with my phone, Chris suddenly appeared. "Oh, what happened to that wall? A makeover?" He laughed at the dirty wall and walked closer to me. "What are you doing here?" The last person I wanted to see showed up, and I felt my irritation rise. Then, a middle-aged couple appeared behind him. "These are my parents. I told them I was wrongfully fired, and they got mad. They want to give you a piece of their mind." As soon as Chris introduced them as his parents, they glared at me with hatred. I sighed, realizing Chris had finally resorted to bringing his parents to confront me. His parents immediately started yelling, "How dare you fire our son?" "It's a misunderstanding." Chris handed in his resignation, and I simply accepted it. I tried to explain what had happened, but as expected, they didn't believe me. They got even angrier and insisted they'd hire a lawyer. My parents are usually lenient with me, but once they get mad, they're scary. They even got a manager fired at my last temp job. "What? Your last temp job?" At that moment, Chris's face suddenly changed, and he quickly covered his mouth with his hand. Chris quickly regained his composure and let out a smug laugh. "So, if you don't want your cafe ruined, you'd better pay me the compensation now." They all started treating me like the villain, hurling insults like "crooked manager." Even though I had done nothing wrong, I was being completely painted as the bad guy, and my anger was at its peak. "Could you please keep it down? There are customers inside." When I said that, Chris and his parents looked confused and glanced at the cafe door. Hey, the door says closed today. Did the stress make you lose your mind or what?" They burst into loud laughter, mocking me. But at that moment, the door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out of the cafe and looked directly at us. "What? Who the hell are you? Stop staring at me!" Chris yelled at the man, so I grabbed Chris's shoulder to calm him down. Hey, you're the one who asked for him to be here." "What?" "He's the inspector from the Labor Standards Office who came to investigate me." As soon as I said that, Inspector Davis nodded, and Chris's face went pale. While Chris and his parents were shocked, I cheerfully said, "Well, Chris came here on his own, so today's turning out to be pretty lucky for me." "What? That makes no sense. You were just angry a minute ago." Confused by the unexpected situation, Chris was clearly uneasy. "But since the inspector is here, it means he's been investigating your harassment, right? So, what's the result?" "The results came in before you arrived, so let's discuss everything now." I said this as I guided them inside the cafe. We all sat at a table, me, Inspector Davis, and Chris with his parents across from us. Now, Inspector Davis would report on whether I had harassed Chris. Although Chris was nervous, he tried to keep his composure. "Hey, my parents are thirsty. At least serve them some coffee. You're the manager, right? You're not customers, so I won't be serving anything. Feel free to run to the vending machine outside." I responded calmly, which made Chris click his tongue in irritation. "Well then, Mr. Davis, please go ahead." Davis nodded and began speaking to them. "Understood. To get straight to the point, we found no evidence of harassment by Steve against Chris." "What? Did you even investigate properly?" Chris, clearly dissatisfied with the findings, leaned over the table. "When I visited to conduct the investigation, I interviewed Steve. It was when I was reviewing the security camera footage that I heard someone calling me from outside, and it was Davis. At that moment, I realized Chris had indeed reported me to the labor board, and I felt a wave of tension. Davis had also looked at me with suspicion, but I couldn't just ignore him, so I closed the cafe for the day and let him inside. A thorough investigation was then conducted. After reviewing Chris's timecard records and Steve's logs, we found that work hours were adhered to and overtime pay was properly paid. There is no basis for the claim of unpaid overtime. As he read from the investigation report he had just compiled, Chris's face twisted in displeasure. His parents also looked unhappy. "But I was wrongfully terminated. I had no intention of quitting, but Steve fired me unilaterally." With his claim of unpaid overtime dismissed, Chris now pushed hard on the wrongful termination angle. I exchanged a glance with Davis, and he nodded. "We've also investigated the wrongful termination claim." "So, how did it go? I wasn't in the wrong, was I?" At this point, I stood up from my chair, went to the shelf, and pulled out something to show to Chris and his parents. This is the resignation letter that Chris handed to me. "You handed this over to Steve along with the other temp workers, didn't you?" At that moment, Davis's suspicious gaze shifted from me to Chris. During the investigation, I had shown Davis the resignation letter as proof that I hadn't harassed Chris. The moment Chris saw his resignation letter, he panicked. "That could have been written by Steve. Stop making pathetic excuses. Your handwriting on this letter matches your resume perfectly." To ensure there was no doubt, I had also shown Davis Chris's resume to confirm that the handwriting matched. "When you were working here, I noticed you could use some lessons in penmanship. Sloppy handwriting leaves a bad impression." Embarrassed, Chris blushed and looked down. I also showed Davis the security camera footage from the cafe, which clearly captured Chris and the others handing in their resignation letters and leaving the cafe. After reviewing all the evidence provided by Steve, we concluded that no harassment occurred. In fact, the more we investigated, the more Chris's misconduct became apparent. He completely cleared me of any suspicion and gave Chris a stern look. "Chris made a false report to me. This is a serious case of false reporting." Chris turned pale and recoiled. According to Article 120 of the Labor Standards Act, anyone who fails to report or makes a false report under the provisions of Article 12 shall be subject to a fine of up to $2,000. Davis continued to glare at Chris, maintaining his calm demeanor. "You claimed wrongful termination and demanded an outrageous amount of compensation from Steve. Now that it's clear this was a false report, it's an extremely malicious act." Chris's face twisted in fear, and cold sweat began to pour down his face. In the worst case, a false report can lead to prosecution and public disclosure, which can utterly destroy a company's reputation. Chris thought he could win by filing a complaint with the labor board, but Davis wasn't that easy to fool. As a result, Chris dug his own grave, and his deceit was exposed. Now that his false report has been uncovered, it's his turn to be investigated. With all the evidence gathered, he's 100% likely to be found guilty. And since Chris is a temp worker, the staffing agency, Moyato Recruit, could also face serious consequences, including a formal charge. You can't get out of this now. Admit the wrongdoing you've committed. Seeing Chris fall silent, his parents stepped in, pleading. We'll pay a settlement. Just please don't press charges, they said, begging. We won't agree to a settlement. Your son's actions won't be easily forgiven. And while we were inside the cafe earlier, I overheard a conversation between Steve and Chris. Chris, it seems you've caused trouble at a previous temp job too. When Davis pointed this out, Chris's eyes widened in clear panic. Did I say that? I don't really remember. Chris tried to laugh it off, but Davis continued to glare at him, not letting it slide. We'll find out about that too when we investigate further. Now, I'll report the results of this investigation to my superiors, so I'll take my leave. Thank you for coming today. Thanks to Chris digging his own grave, my innocence has been proven. As I walked him out, Chris, now terrified, asked me, That could have been written by Steve. I can't say for sure, but considering your actions, it's almost certain. You'd better prepare yourself. Upon hearing this, Chris buried his head in his hands and began to plead. Please help me. I don't want to be arrested. I'll pay whatever it takes to settle this. His parents also joined in, desperately begging for a settlement, offering to pay any amount. But I had already made up my mind. Because of you, I was nearly forced to close my cafe. I know you're the one who killed the potted flowers and vandalized the wall. What? Realizing all his actions had been exposed, Chris was left speechless. As Davis was leaving the cafe, he turned back and said, It seems you've committed several other crimes besides making a false report. Your punishment will be even more severe. Please help me. I don't want to be arrested. I'll pay whatever it takes to settle this. Pleading desperately, Chris and his parents were pushed out of the cafe as I responded. Someone who can't tell right from wrong can't be left unchecked. You'd better prepare yourself because you will be found guilty. No, I'll get down on my knees and beg. Just please forgive me. Chris dropped to his knees on the ground, begging for forgiveness. But it was too late for apologies. The damage to my heart and my cafe couldn't be undone. He would pay for the crime of ruining my precious cafe. Do your reflecting in prison. Ignoring the sobbing Chris, I called the police. Afterward, the police arrived at the cafe, and I explained the damages to them. The security camera footage clearly showed Chris pouring household detergent on the flowers. It also captured him spraying graffiti on the cafe wall, making his guilt 100%, no, 120% certain. All of these acts were carried out after I had closed the cafe, and during a long interrogation, Chris confessed to his crimes. He also admitted to writing defamatory comments on review sites in an attempt to damage the cafe's reputation. Furthermore, Davis's investigation revealed that Chris had pulled a similar stunt at a previous temp job, where he accused the manager of wrongdoing, wrote bad reviews about the store, and eventually forced it to close. Davis discovered this after meeting with the previous manager and conducting his investigation. The manager had contacted Moyato Recruit, but they dismissed the claims, saying there was no evidence of such behavior. By covering up the labor law violations committed by their temp workers, the responsible person at Moyato Recruit also became subject to prosecution. As a result, Chris was arrested for making a false report, vandalism, extortion through demands for excessive compensation, and defamation. All of these were considered extremely malicious crimes that endangered people's livelihoods, and he was sentenced to prison. He received a fine of $1,250 and a prison term of up to 5 years, leading to his imprisonment. I hired a lawyer and filed a claim against Chris for the cost of repairing the wall, which his parents ended up paying on his behalf. Since Chris is still young at 23, he'll likely be released around the age of 27. However, Even though the law may eventually forgive him, the consequences of his repeated offenses will be severe. After Chris's arrest, the news quickly spread through the neighborhood, and his parents, unable to bear the shame, moved far away. Even if Chris re-enters society, he'll carry the stigma of a criminal record for life. He'll be judged by those around him, and finding a job will be incredibly difficult. If he had reconciled with me when he handed in his resignation, he wouldn't have lost everything like his money, his livelihood, and his relationships. He could have continued working as a temp, and since he was capable, there was even a chance for a future as a full-time employee. But when asked during the interrogation why he committed the crimes, Chris responded, "I didn't like being ordered around by the manager. So I planned to get a big compensation payout through a wrongful termination claim. I never want to hire someone like Chris again." After the incident, my cafe slowly regained its customers. For a while, I ran the shop by myself. But as word of mouth spread, the cafe began attracting long lines of customers daily, becoming very busy again. It got so hectic that I decided to call back the 2 temp workers who had reconciled with me. After terminating their contract with Moyato Recruit, they had been working part-time jobs, but when I contacted them, they were so excited that they rushed to the cafe that very day. They seemed to have seriously reflected on their past behavior and began working diligently, like completely different people. I was surprised to see them working hard without slacking off or making unreasonable demands. And it reminded me that people can change. Now, they report to me if they have any issues, and we've built a strong relationship of trust. If they stay with me long enough, I'm considering offering them full-time positions and possibly making one of them the manager of a second location. When I mentioned the possibility of full-time positions, they were thrilled and vowed to work together to grow the cafe.